That satisfies Friday morning in October. The betrayal didn't just break my heart, it shattered something I had poured my entire soul into for 3 decades. I stood in the corner of the grand ballroom at the Four Seasons Houston, watching 350 guests raise their champagne glasses to my brother-in-law, the man who had convinced my own sister to help him steal everything I had built. The chandeliers sparkled. The jazz quartet played smooth melodies. The ice sculpture of our restaurant logo, a longhorn steer with flames behind it, slowly dripped onto the white tablecloth. I remember thinking how appropriate that was. Everything I had created was melting away right in front of me. Richard Callahan stood at the podium in his custom Italian suit, the one he bragged cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was 47 minutes into his speech. I knew because I had been watching the clock on the far wall, counting each minute like a prisoner counting days until release. And I want to thank everyone who believed in the Lone Star Smokehouse vision, Richard said, his voice smooth as honey through the microphone. Our loyal customers, our incredible staff, and most importantly, the entrepreneurial spirit that built this empire from nothing. The entrepreneurial spirit. His spirit, apparently. No mention of the 23-year-old kid who had mortgaged his parents' home in 1994 to open a tiny barbecue shack on the outskirts of San Antonio. No mention of the secret dry rub recipe my grandmother had passed down to me on her deathbed, the one that became the foundation of everything we served. No mention of the 14-hour days I spent smoking brisket, perfecting technique, building a reputation one plate at a time. No mention of me at all. I shifted my weight against the wall. My back ached from 40 years of standing over smokers, lifting heavy cuts of meat, working through pain because the restaurant couldn't wait. At 63 years old, my body carried every sacrifice I had ever made for this business. Richard looked like he had just stepped out of a spa. He hadn't touched a smoker in 15 years. Said his talents were better used on brand development and strategic partnerships. The applause erupted as Richard finally finished. I watched him step down from the podium, and that's when my sister Linda approached him with a small remote control in her hand. "Richard," she said, her voice amplified by her lapel microphone, "the family wanted to surprise you with something special for leading Lone Star Smokehouse to such incredible heights." She pressed the button. The ballroom doors opened, and 2 valets drove in a brand-new Porsche 911 Turbo S, midnight blue. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted the price. $85,000. Everyone laughed and cheered like it was the greatest joke they had ever heard. Richard hugged Linda. He hugged our general managers. He posed for photographs with his arm around the car, grinning like he had just won the lottery. Then Linda walked toward me. I straightened up. Despite everything, despite the growing suspicion that had been eating at me for months, something hopeful flickered in my chest. 30 years. Surely there would be acknowledgement. Surely my own sister remembered who had actually created the recipes, who had built the original restaurant, who had brought her husband into the business in the first place. "Walter," Linda said, smiling in that distant way she had smiled at me ever since she married Richard 22 years ago. "We didn't forget about you." She handed me a small bag. Not a box, not even an envelope with any weight to it. A paper gift bag you could buy at any dollar store. I opened it right there, next to the dessert table covered in pecan pies and peach cobbler made from recipes I had developed myself. Inside was an apron. A cheap promotional apron with our restaurant logo on it, the kind we gave away to customers during special events. And tucked inside the apron pocket was a gift card to Rudy's BBQ. $30 to a competitor's restaurant. There was a handwritten note from Linda. "Thanks for getting us started. Enjoy your retirement." Retirement. I wasn't retired. I was 63 years old and still came to work every single day. I still trained every new pitmaster personally. I still tasted every batch of sauce to ensure quality. I still greeted regular customers by name. And my sister thanked me for getting us started like I was some distant memory from ancient history. I looked across the room. Richard caught my eye. He raised his champagne glass toward me, that self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He knew exactly what message was being sent. I set the gift bag on the dessert table, turned around, and walked out of the Four Seasons Houston at exactly 9:23 the evening. Behind me, 350 people, continued celebrating a man who had systematically erased me from the story of my own life. The humid October air wrapped around me as I stepped onto Lamar Street. Houston at night. All those glittering skyscrapers and fancy restaurants, people laughing on patios, living their normal Friday night lives, while mine quietly collapsed. I didn't go home. I couldn't face Margaret yet. She had been so proud of me tonight, had helped me pick out my suit, had kissed me goodbye and told me I deserved every bit of recognition coming my way. How could I tell her that her husband, the founder of one of Texas's most successful barbecue chains, had been reduced to a $30 gift card to a competitor? Instead, I drove. I ended up at the original location, the tiny shack on Fredericksburg Road in San Antonio, where everything had started. The building was different now, expanded and renovated, but I parked in the same spot where I used to park my beat-up Ford pickup back in 1994. I sat there in the dark, engine off, staring at the neon sign that bore my grandmother's name, Grandma May's Lone Star Smokehouse. That's when my phone buzzed. An email from Thomas Chen, our corporate attorney. Subject line, confidential, acquisition documents, final review. I opened it with trembling fingers. The email had been sent to Richard. I was copied by mistake, buried in a long CC list that Thomas had probably auto-populated from an old distribution group. Richard. The email read, as discussed, here are the finalized acquisition documents with Walter's equity position adjusted to the percentage we agreed upon. The buyer has accepted the 6% payout to him given his minimal operational involvement in recent years. Ready to proceed with the November 30th closing date. Let me know if you want to schedule the signing. I read it 4 times. Then I read it again. Richard was selling our company, the restaurant chain we had built together, the brand that carried my grandmother's name, and he was giving me 6%. 6% of what had to be a $50 million sale. I pulled out my phone's calculator. 6% of $50 million was $3 million. That might sound like a lot to most people, but according to our original partnership agreement, signed in 2002 when I brought Richard into the business as an equal partner after he married my sister, I owned 50% of Lone Star Smokehouse. 50% of $50 million was $25 million. Richard was stealing $22 million from me. And he had just made sure I knew my place with that smirk and that wave across a ballroom, standing next to an $85,000 Porsche that was probably bought with money that should have been mine. I sat in that parking lot until 2 a.m., reading and rereading that email until the words blurred together. A security guard knocked on my window to ask if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I was lying. Finally, I drove the 3 hours back to Houston. Margaret was asleep. I didn't wake her. Instead, I went to my study, the small room at the back of our house that still smelled faintly of mesquite smoke no matter how many times Margaret aired it out. I pulled out the fireproof safe I hadn't opened in years. Inside were the original documents, the partnership agreement, the incorporation papers, the loan documents from when my parents mortgaged their home to help me start the business, the handwritten recipe cards from Grandma May, her cursive faded but still legible. And there, in a folder I had almost forgotten about, was something Richard didn't know existed. In 1998, 4 years before Richard joined the company, I had trademarked Grandma May's dry rub recipe. Not the company. Me, Walter James Patterson, private citizen. I had done it on the advice of an old family friend who was a lawyer. He told me that recipes themselves couldn't be copyrighted, but the specific blend and the brand name could be protected. He helped me file the trademark for Grandma May's original Texas dry rub under my personal name. The company had been licensing the trademark from me ever since. A nominal fee, barely enough to cover the renewal costs. Richard had probably never even noticed the small line item buried in our annual expenses. But legally, officially, the trademark belonged to me, and that dry rub was on every single piece of meat we served. It was the foundation of our entire brand identity. It was what made Lone Star Smokehouse different from every other barbecue joint in Texas. Without that trademark, the company couldn't use the recipe. Without the recipe, there was no Lone Star Smokehouse. I pulled out the trademark registration certificate. My name, clear as day. Then I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I called in sick to work. The next morning, while Richard was probably polishing his new Porsche, I drove to Austin to meet with Patricia Okonkwo, a lawyer who specialized in intellectual property and corporate disputes. I had found her name through a friend of a friend who had gone through a messy business divorce. I brought every document I had. "How long before the sale closes?" Patricia asked, spreading papers across her conference table. "November 30th. That's about 6 weeks. She nodded, her pen tapping against her legal pad. "Here's what we know. According to your original partnership agreement, you own 50% of the company. Unless there's been an amendment you signed, that ownership stake is legally binding. The fact that he's trying to push through a sale, giving you only 6%, is problematic at best, fraudulent at worst. Can he do it? Can he actually cut me out? Not legally. But Walter, I need to ask you something important. Have you signed anything unusual in the past few years? Any documents Richard presented as routine paperwork, annual reviews, corporate restructuring agreements?" I thought back. There had been plenty of documents over the years: tax filings, insurance renewals, lease agreements for new locations. Had I read every single one carefully? I wanted to say yes. But I had to be honest. "I don't know," I admitted. Richard always handled the legal and financial side. I trusted him. He's my brother-in-law. He's been married to my sister for over 20 years. Patricia's expression told me that wasn't the answer she wanted to hear. "We need to review everything," she said. "Every document you've signed for the past decade. If Richard is confident enough to push through a sale that cuts you out, he's laid groundwork somewhere. Men like him don't make moves like this without legal cover." I spent the next 3 weeks living a double life. During the day, I went to work like nothing had changed. I smiled at Richard in the hallways. I attended management meetings. I trained new employees. I even wore the cheap apron my sister had given me, just to see if anyone would say anything. No one did. But every evening, I drove to Austin to meet with Patricia. We reconstructed 30 years of business history. Every contract, every signature, every board meeting that had apparently happened without my knowledge. The picture that emerged made me physically ill. For the past 12 years, Richard had been systematically repositioning himself as the sole creative force behind Lone Star Smokehouse. He had given interviews to food magazines claiming he had perfected the recipes. He had registered new trademarks for menu items under his name alone. He had even trademarked our slogan, "Taste the Lone Star Tradition," without ever telling me. He had formed a separate company, RC Hospitality Holdings, which now held the licensing rights to several of our most profitable catering contracts. Those contracts weren't even on our books anymore. They were his personal revenue stream. "He's been planning this for over a decade," Patricia said during one of our late-night sessions. "This isn't opportunistic. This is calculated betrayal." How did I not see it? "Because you were doing the actual work," she said simply. "You were in the kitchens. You were training staff. You were maintaining quality. You were building the product while he was building the appearance of ownership. And my sister? Linda has to know about this." Patricia paused. Based on the corporate filings, Linda is listed as CFO of RC Hospitality Holdings. She's been signing documents for his shadow company for at least 8 years. My own sister, the little girl I had taught to ride a bike, the teenager I had driven to prom when our dad was too drunk to do it, the woman I had welcomed into my business, into my life's work, because she married a man who promised to help us grow. She had been helping him rob me blind. On November 10th, Richard called an informal meeting, just the two of us, at a steakhouse in the Galleria area. The kind of place with leather booths and dim lighting designed for conversations you didn't want overheard. "Walter," Richard said, cutting into a 42-ounce tomahawk ribeye that cost more than some families spend on groceries in a week. "I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity." "The sale," I said flatly. He paused, knife and fork hovering. "You know about that? I was copied on Thomas's email. Accidentally, I assume." His jaw tightened for just a moment before the smooth salesman mask slipped back into place. "Right. Well, then you understand the situation. We have a buyer. Excellent terms. Clean exit for both of us. 6% isn't an exit for me, Richard. It's robbery. He set down his utensils with exaggerated patience. Walter, let's be realistic here. Yes, on paper, you own 50%. But what have you actually contributed in the past decade? I've been the face of this brand. I've brought in 90% of our investor relationships. I've built the expansion strategy that took us from one location to 23. I've developed every recipe we serve. I've trained every pitmaster in our organization. I've maintained the quality standards that made our reputation. Cooking isn't leadership, Walter. There's a difference. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost sympathetic. Look, I'm being generous with 6%. The buyer doesn't even think you're necessary to the transition. I convinced them to include you at all. Out of respect for our history. Our history. 30 years reduced to a footnote that merited 6%. No, I said. No deal. I don't approve this sale. Richard smiled, and there was nothing friendly about it. Walter, you don't have approval rights. Check the amendments we signed in 2019. During the corporate restructuring, either partner can authorize a sale with 45 days' notice to the other partner. I gave you that notice at the anniversary party. The apron was a courtesy. The formal paperwork will be filed on Monday. Amendments we signed in 2019. The corporate restructuring documents. I remembered signing something. Richard had presented a stack of papers as routine updates to our operating agreement. I had trusted him. I'll fight it, I said. Richard picked up his wine glass, swirling the red liquid casually. With what resources? Legal fees for a case like this will drain you. The sale will close. You'll get your $3 million, and that will be the end of it. He paused. Or you can accept this gracefully. Take the money. Retire for real this time. Spend time with Margaret. Travel. You've earned a rest. I stood up, leaving my untouched steak on the plate. Where are you going? Richard asked. To do something I should have done years ago. I walked out while Richard sat there, probably already calculating how he would spend my $22 million. I called Patricia from my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. He has amendments that supposedly give him unilateral sale authority. Claims I signed them in 2019. Do you remember signing them? Vaguely. But I didn't read them carefully. I trusted him. There was a long pause. Walter, I need to tell you something. I pulled records on RC Hospitality Holdings today. Richard's shadow company? It's been licensing your grandmother's dry rub trademark from you for the past 12 years. What? The licensing agreement you signed back in 1998? It included provisions for sublicensing. Richard set up his company to sublicense from you, then licensed to Lone Star Smokehouse. It's convoluted, but it means the main company's use of your trademark runs through his shadow company. I don't understand. What does that mean? It means if you terminate your licensing agreement with RC Hospitality Holdings, Richard loses the right to sublicense your trademark to Lone Star Smokehouse. And if Lone Star Smokehouse can't legally use Grandma May's original Texas dry rub, the entire brand identity collapses. My blood ran cold, then hot, then something else entirely. Can I do that? Just terminate? The original agreement allows either party to terminate with 60 days written notice. You never updated it. Richard probably never thought you'd figure out what he was doing, so he never bothered to lock you in with more restrictive terms. Grandma May's dry rub. The recipe she had taught me when I was 15 years old, standing in her tiny kitchen in Corpus Christi, learning to measure spices by feel and smell rather than cups and teaspoons. The foundation of everything. Richard had built his empire on my grandmother's legacy, and now that legacy was going to bring his whole scheme crashing down. What do I do? I asked. We take away his ammunition. Then we show him what happens when you try to erase someone who built the foundation you're standing on. On November 15th, I did 3 things. First, I formally rejected the sale. Regardless of what amendments Richard thought he had, I put my opposition in writing. My lawyer filed objections with every relevant party. Second, I filed a lawsuit against Richard, Linda, RC Hospitality Holdings, and Lone Star Smokehouse for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and violation of partnership agreement. If Richard wanted to sell, fine. But We would do it properly, with proper valuation, proper division of assets, and proper recognition of who had built what. Third, and most importantly, I sent a certified letter to RC Hospitality Holdings, formally terminating the trademark licensing agreement for Grandma May's original Texas dry rub, effective 60 days from receipt. The buyer was in the middle of due diligence. They were reviewing our brand assets, our intellectual property, our recipes, and I had just pulled the pin on a grenade that would blow up the entire deal. Richard called me at 6:47 that morning. I was sitting on my back porch, watching the sun rise over the Houston skyline, drinking coffee that Margaret had made for me after I finally told her everything. She hadn't slept all night after I explained what Richard and Linda had done. She had cried. She had raged. She had held me while I broke down for the first time in 30 years. But when the sun came up, she had made coffee and told me to finish what I had started. I watched my phone light up with Richard's name. I didn't answer. He called again at 6:52. And 6:58. And 7:03. By noon, he had called 31 times. I finally answered on call number 32. "Walter, what the hell are you doing?" His voice wasn't smooth anymore. It cracked around the edges with something that sounded almost like fear. "Terminating a licensing agreement. I own the trademark to our core recipe. I'm ending the license. You can't do this. The deal falls apart without that trademark. Then I guess you have a problem. Walter, please, be reasonable." Reasonable? From a man who tried to steal my life's work for 6%? Here's reasonable, Richard. We split everything 50-50, exactly like the original partnership agreement specifies. You get 25 million. I get 25 million. We walk away clean. That's insane. I built this company's national profile. I brought in the investors. I created the expansion strategy. You stood on my grandmother's shoulders and convinced yourself you could fly, I interrupted. Without her recipe, without my work, without the foundation I built, you'd still be a mediocre car salesman trying to charm your way through life. I'll fight the trademark termination in court. Go ahead. It'll take years. The buyer won't wait years. Your deal will be dead long before any judge rules. I'll sue you for tortious interference. Sue me. I'll countersue for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy. We'll let a jury of regular Texans decide who's the victim here. The founder who created the recipes, or the brother-in-law who tried to steal $22 million from his own family. Silence on the other end. I could hear him breathing, calculating, trying to find an angle. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "I already told you. 50-50. And one more thing." "What?" "That Porsche. The $85,000 car you got at the anniversary party. I want you to sell it and donate the money to the Houston Food Bank in my grandmother's name." "That's petty." "No, Richard. That's poetic. That car represented what you thought this was all about. Status, recognition, being celebrated while others did the real work. But my grandmother spent her whole life feeding people who were hungry. So you're going to take your trophy and turn it into something that actually honors her memory." He hung up. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard tried everything. He sent lawyers with threatening letters. He sent Linda to my house, crying and begging me to reconsider. He even sent our general manager with an increased offer of 15%. I didn't budge. Linda's visit was the hardest. She stood on my porch, mascara running down her cheeks, telling me I was destroying the family. Margaret stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder, and told Linda that the family had been destroyed the moment she and Richard decided to steal from her own brother. Linda left in tears. I haven't spoken to her since. On November 28th, Patricia called me with the news. The buyer pulled out. "The deal is dead." I closed my eyes. Good. Richard's lawyer called this morning. He wants to negotiate a settlement. Tell him I'm available tomorrow. That's Thanksgiving. I know. Tell him that's the only day I'm free. We met at Patricia's office in Austin on Thanksgiving morning. Richard looked like he had aged 10 years in 2 weeks. The confident swagger was gone. His suit was wrinkled. He hadn't shaved. The Porsche keys sat on the conference table between us. He had already listed it for sale. His lawyer laid out the terms. 50-50 split of all assets. Full dissolution of the partnership. RC Hospitality Holdings, to be transferred to my control as compensation for the fraudulent sublicensing scheme, and a written acknowledgement to be published in the Houston Chronicle's business section that I had been the co-founder and creative force behind Lone Star Smokehouse from day one. "There's one more thing," I said. Richard looked up, exhausted. "The apron. The one Linda gave me at the anniversary party. I want you to wear it while you make a public statement at our original San Antonio location, thanking me for 30 years of partnership." His jaw clenched. "That's humiliating." "No, Richard. What's humiliating is giving your business partner of 30 years a $30 gift card to a competitor's restaurant while you drive away in a Porsche. This is just balance." He stared at me for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the sound of a man who had finally realized how completely he had lost. "You know what, Walter? Fine. You win." "This was never about winning," I said. "This was about truth." We signed the dissolution papers on December 15th. The company's assets were sold off separately over the following months. Some locations were bought by former employees who wanted to keep running them. Some were acquired by other restaurant groups. A few just closed. The San Antonio original, the tiny shack where everything had started, I bought myself. I paid market value, even though I could have pushed for a discount. It felt right to do it cleanly. Richard wore the apron at the press conference, just like I had demanded. He read a prepared statement acknowledging my role in building the company. His voice was flat, mechanical, the words clearly forced, but he said them, and the Houston Chronicle printed every one. The Porsche sold for $81,000. Every penny went to the Houston Food Bank, with a dedication plaque in my grandmother's name installed at their main facility. Richard and Linda moved to Florida. I heard they started a consulting business. I hope they find some kind of peace. Carrying that much greed and deception has to be exhausting. The day the final settlement check cleared, Margaret and I sat on our back porch. The same porch where I had ignored 47 of Richard's desperate phone calls. The Houston skyline glittered in the distance. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Whatever we want," I said. "For the first time in 30 years, I get to choose." We kept the original San Antonio location, renamed it simply Grandma May's. I stripped away all the corporate branding, all the expansion-era additions, everything that Richard had touched. I went back to the basics. Me, a smoker, and my grandmother's recipes. I work 3 days a week now. Not because I have to, but because I want to. I train young pitmasters who remind me of myself at 23, hungry and determined and willing to learn. I tell them my grandmother's stories while I teach them how to feel when the meat is ready, how to smell when the smoke is right. Margaret and I travel the other 4 days. We've seen places we always talked about visiting but never had time for. Paris, Tokyo, that little beach town in Costa Rica where the sunsets turn the whole sky orange and pink. The money sits in accounts, more than we'll ever spend. We've set up scholarships for culinary students in my grandmother's name. We donate to food banks across Texas. We help former Lone Star employees who want to start their own places. Sometimes, when I'm standing over the smoker at Grandma May's, watching the mesquite smoke curl into the San Antonio sky, I think about those 47 phone calls. Richard's voice getting more desperate with each message, begging me to reconsider, threatening me, pleading with me, finally just asking why. I never answered that last question, but the answer was simple. Because you forgot who built the foundation you were standing on. Because you convinced yourself that the person doing the real work didn't matter. Because you thought you could erase 30 years of someone's life with a cheap apron and a gift card to a competitor. You thought wrong. The smoke rises. The brisket cooks slow and low, the way Grandma May taught me. Customers line up outside, just like they did 30 years ago. Some things change. Empires rise and fall. Partnerships dissolve. Brothers-in-law become strangers. But some things stay the same. Good food, honest work. The legacy of a grandmother who believed that feeding people was the most important thing a person could do. Richard tried to steal that legacy. He failed. And now, every plate of barbecue that leaves my kitchen carries her name, her recipes, her memory. Not because some corporate document says so, because I'm the one who actually learned at her side. I'm the one who carried her traditions forward. I'm the one who refused to let someone else take credit for what she built. That's worth more than any Porsche, more than any settlement check, more than all the champagne toasts and fancy anniversary parties in the world. It's worth everything.